So we'll have a look at this game. It features a lot of interesting themes from the Sveshnikov Sicilian. It is quite a high-level game. It is very complex, so it's hard to generalize these things. So let's just have a look. So it started, as mentioned, as a Sveshnikov, and quite soon the players got out of theory. Here white played this h4 move, which is quite typical, but not exactly the main move in this specific position, though it is possible. a4 is the most played move, since black cannot defend with rook b8 at this point, because here theory suggests that this is quite a bit passive for black. This rook being on b8 doesn't really help with b4 in this position, so if rook b8 is not possible, white is happy to get this structure, and then maybe continue with h4 a bit later. But these are small nuances. h4, bishop h6, knight e3. And here, the way I understand this position is that the fight is for the d5 square. So both sides would like to get rid of the pieces that cannot go to d5. So white has already gotten rid of his dark squared bishop, which helped him get control over d5 by getting rid of a defender, while black's problem piece is in general this bishop, of course, which cannot ever defend d5. It can only indirectly defend d5 by getting rid of the opponent's pieces, which can defend this square. So in general, I think when given the chance, if possible, black should get rid of this bishop. Of course, it's easy to talk after we've seen the next move, which is bishop e6, and now, as the player has pointed out, white has the chance to go knight f5, and now black will hardly get rid of his bishop, and it will sit on h6 without much use. For example, if white takes, and the immediate threat is to take here and give this check, but also there's just this ruining the structure, so black kinda has to take. He should probably get rid of this knight, and in such a situation with opposite colored bishops, the bishop is not really well placed here, and this is kind of a standard good position for white, and the pawn storm might come, and eventual g6 whenever white has a bishop or a knight on d5. So this should be considered a bad position for black, and it's all because black couldn't fight for the d5 square. Instead, if he had taken here, white has to recapture like this, bishop e6. Next move can be knight e7, maybe queen c6, queen c7 or queen b6, put some rooks on c8, d8, and then see what happens. Maybe play f5 at some point. If d5 happens, then black will have no problems. And all the time, this h4 move isn't necessarily useful for white. He would like to castle eventually, and the position is equal. After this, knight f5 was missed, bishop e2. Again, black has the chance to take. Instead, he goes knight e7. So he is, after all, fighting for the square on d5. But now white could again avoid the exchange of this bishop by playing knight g4, which again kind of forces black to react, because this is an unpleasant threat. For example, if takes here, again white gets an opposite colored bishop position, and in general those are quite good for white as long as he has this square. If there's a pawn on d5, then it is not good, and we will see such a scenario a bit later. So here a4 was played, but here it seems a bit too late for a4. Black doesn't really care much about this. The fight for the d5 square has begun. For example, here black can even take to get a tempo and open the b file. For example, here, and after something like b4, rook fd8, d5 is in general coming. If not, then black can at least get his bishop to c6, and he has basically no bad pieces. There are some weaknesses, but nothing that black can't survive. So ba happened, rook a4, a5, and after a few moves, here black is basically fine, because he is getting control of the d5 square, and by that I mean he is threatening to take here, which will eventually make white put a pawn on d5, which would be a small concession for white. He would like to have this square for a piece, but now that won't really be possible, because after bishop c4 this pawn is hanging. So white played rook a2, and f5 was played. Already black can consider taking here, and as you will see, that will still be a chance later. Of course, this pawn is a little bit weak, and the problem is this bishop is a bit misplaced. It would like to be potentially on this diagonal, but now it is quite far away from it. It will take a while. So this isn't necessary. Black has the two bishops. White isn't really making real threats yet, so black can improve his position. Okay, f5. Bishop f3 is a nice move. And now black decided to take. But this is tension that doesn't necessarily favor white, so there's no real reason to take here. For example, after king h8, getting out of the discoveries, if white tries to do something like this, of course the bishop looks at the queen and the rook, but the knight can't really go anywhere effectively. Also e4 will happen. So black has the two bishops and they're quite effective, and in some positions rook takes f3 is a big threat, so the bishop being on f3 is more vulnerable than on e4. So this was a small inaccuracy. There was no reason to really take here. Okay, the game goes on. White castles, queen b8. Black was feeling a bit uncomfortable with his queen and rook here, but since for now there are no real discoveries and also this rook is hanging, there is no reason to be scared of this. Black can play this g6 move, which is quite sensible, the point being to eventually bring this bishop to some more useful diagonal, maybe even to f8 to defend this, or to g7 to eventually open up like this, if possible. But here, white played g4, and g4 is a very extreme move, so to say. White should understand that he has gained the positional advantage, he has gained control of the d5 square, and he doesn't really have to go for dynamics like attacking on the king side. The weaknesses are already created, so to say. There's this weakness, there's this. White doesn't really need to attack the king here. So g4 in that sense really doesn't make any sense. White should instead just put his pawns a bit better to get rid of the pressure on b2, maybe play c4 to make his queen and bishop more mobile, double on the a file, and try to just take this pawn if possible. But g4, now black goes for something very concrete, but at the same time quite abstract. So first, let's see that black has a pretty simple solution with bishop f4, since the threat is g5. The alternative is g6, but bishop f4 is much more active. And now the threat has been handled, and white has just weakened his king side for apparently no reason. There is no real attack here. So black, of course, can see that he can do this. But instead he saw something very concrete, starting with queen d8. Now white has to win the piece. Black sacrifices. Bishop g2 has to be played, otherwise this check will pick up the bishop. And the e4, again the concrete variation continues. The knight is hanging and it's pinned, so c4 has to be played. And presumably black saw up until here and calculated a bit further and played this rook f3 move. But if I were to see this position from afar, I wouldn't be convinced this is so good, because, well, we are a piece down, and this move, it's hard to understand what even is the threat. Well, I guess bishop h3 is the immediate threat, with the idea after knight e3 to take here. But there are a couple of ways white can handle this. As mentioned, queen c1 is a very good move. And I don't think black should resign, but of course it's not great. Again, this is a move with tempi. This is something that has to be seen if we want to calculate rook f3. There's not many other forcing moves here, especially ones that deal with this threat. So after queen c1, for example, queen g4, let's say. Now it's important for white to understand the threat and put the queen on d2, or maybe even exchange rooks. Probably this would be a bit more effectual, for example here, here. Eventually white would like to maybe double whenever this is not hanging. And the big problem for black is that there isn't really an immediate threat. The engine suggests stuff like h5, h4, but if we're sacrificing a piece in a position where we don't have to, this is a bit too speculative. This is more of a gamble than a piece sacrifice. So this was kind of hard to understand, why black would sacrifice his piece like this, especially when there's this simple solution. But okay, if we see something concrete, then we can go for it. But up until here, it was quite concrete, so it was easy to see. But from here, it's hard to understand what's the follow-up. But okay, rook f3. Also, white has this very good move b4. It is quite deep. Of course, the immediate reason is just to take here and create a passed pawn. But also the rook is now a good defender. For example, if here, white has the defense with knight e3. Reason being that now the rook can defend the g2 pawn, the g2 square. So this is of course not easy to see for white, but queen c1 is I think a lot easier. The queen is not doing much anyway. Instead king h1 was played, which makes sense, but suddenly black's attack is very strong, and he could start with the move bishop g4, creating the immediate threat of rook h3. And it's important to understand the magnitude of the threat. For example, after b4, if he goes here, in this moment black doesn't really have much material, but at the end there's queen h5, forking the pieces. So now the threat would be quite big, and it's hard to see how white should defend. He cannot take here, and also if he goes back, for example, now bishop h3, white has lost the tempo, and now checkmate is imminent. But instead black brings the piece, which is fair enough. Rook a5, gives a check, takes on f2, and here black has at least a perpetual, but of course he can play for more. He goes e3, and now the position is extremely dangerous for white. He can defend if he finds rook e1, which is sensible enough, defending the e1 square for the future, planning queen g1 as in the game. Instead queen g1 was played, but now black found this simple tactic with check, check, and taking the rook. And from here he doesn't even have to checkmate anymore, he has a lot of material, and the game ended quite soon. Not much else happened here. There are many ways to win, and black chose one of them. But the key moment was probably when white played g4. Already g4 in itself is a big mistake, especially if we can see this move. This completely negates the pawn on g4, and now there are only questions as to why white weakened his king like this. There was absolutely no reason to do this, especially in a position of superior positional advantages. But after this, with queen d8, again there was not any real reason to sacrifice a piece unless we can see some very concrete reason. So perhaps this is a style issue for black. Maybe he likes to play ultra dynamically like this, but we cannot always sacrifice stuff. It doesn't always work. And here, if white had played queen c1 or some other move like b4, the attack objectively wouldn't really work out. Though of course it does look scary, but objectively doesn't work.